Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Appreciate you guys tuning in, making the time to be here. Thank you for that. Shout out to everybody in the live chat. It's only a few of us here, but it should get more crowded as we go. All right. Thank you for tuning in. Appreciate everybody that's here. All right. We're going to go ahead and get into this pretty good article, or actually book. Yeah, let me just go to it right now. All right. Let me know if at any point the music is louder than my voice. All right. All right. Make sure to let me know. So we're going to get into this right here. It says Sojourners of the Caribbean, Ethnogenesis and Ethnohistory of the Garifuna by Nancy L. Gonzalez from the University of Illinois Press. Okay. It's about, let me see, 1988 it says here. But when the memory of Rebecca Livingston from 1920s, 1972. Okay, that's her dedication right there. We're going to go ahead and read some parts of this as we go. And mainly the first part of this article. Okay, because it's a lot actually. Let's just read a little bit of the introduction real quick. All right. Let's just read a little bit of the introduction. How many of us here now? Yeah. How you guys doing? Thank you. Thank you. Welcome. Welcome. I'm not sure if we should wait for more people or we should just go. Welcome, welcome. So introduction, the meaning of ethnicity. So we're going to pull out the babies, remember. We're going to pull out the babies. We're going to dash any hijacks we see, all right? We're going to get to some specific stuff in the book. Yeah, that's what's up. Happy birthday to your daughter. Yeah. Okay, so it says this book is about the Garifuna, more commonly known in the anthropological literature as Black Caribs. Okay, Black Caribs. Black Caribs, a people who presently inhabit the Atlantic littoral of Central America from Belize to Nicaragua. There are also clusters of Garifuna in several Central American cities and in the United States. Many travelers and missionaries and several ethnologists have visited and written about the Caribs over 250 or so years during which they have existed as a distinct people. Their culture and society have been the subject of 15 or more doctoral dissertations since the 1950s, most of which have purposely dealt with the more traditional aspect of Carib culture, in part because that is what anthropologists do, and in part because it was recognized that time would soon erode the old ways, leaving only a diminishing memory of them among the elders. All right. The latter process, known as acculturation or sometimes modernization, has been of concern to many anthropologists, including me. All right, C. Gonzalez, 1969. The baseline in such studies is always the recent past or even the present, when the aim is to warn development-minded people or agencies what the future pretends if this or that policy is or is not followed. All right, so they get into some politics here. Wow, welcome. We're gonna go ahead and keep going. Is what I'm saying. We're gonna read a couple parts here. So check this out. Okay. It says, I was immediately faced with the analytic problem of how to define the time and space boundaries of the social-cultural group with which I was dealing, when had they in fact become a distinct people. It was known that their ancestors had lived on the islands of St. Vincent and the Lesser Antilles, and that their language was closely related to those still spoken among Amerindians in Amazonia. But check this out. This is the hijack, the Ray does the hijack, right? It says, but the blackness of their skin believed the notion that they had no roots in Africa. Even though neither their own folklore nor scientific analysis had provided any concrete evidence of that. They don't have that in their folklore. Main thing, in their oral traditions, they're not from Africa, nor any DNA or scientific analysis. Should the possibility of African past be ignored or downplayed as they themselves preferred in the 1950s? See, they themselves, their own people said, hey, in the 1950s, we're not Africans. But you guys understand now, right? Like a lot of you listening know the last 8 years what we have been learning, researching. There was black, so-called black Caribs before Europeans arrived. There was black, so-called Indian, so-called black, many shades of copper, even dark copper, dark brown, dark swarthy, coppery brown, as we have been learning over the years, approaching to so-called black, that of the Negro, you know, all these descriptions, just like the Negro or Negroes of the land, right? Negroes of the land. You guys hearing me? We got enough of you guys tuned in? Yeah. So look how they're telling you and admitting that the elders here in the 1950s, the Garifuna people, they're like, hey, we ain't African, man. Most anthropologists choose to do that until very recently, even though the empirical evidence caused us to hedge some of the time. All right, so I get everybody's like, oh, but they're black, Kurimeo, they're black, they have to be African. Well, again, we have black Indians also. We know many of the slaves coming from Europe. So if anything, if you want to add any other foreign so-called blackness, you guys hearing me? You know, I'm not trying to like, this is just from the research, right? We know there was black Irish, black Dutch, so-called those black French, Huguenots, black Jacobites, black, all this from Europe. We know that, black Scots. If anything, too, with the indigenous so-called black Caribs and black populations of the Americas, if anything. Douglas Taylor, for example, has described the black Carib culture as a Negro cake composed of Amerindian ingredients. You see that? What is this Negro cake? Because American Indians couldn't be black, right? Or so-called Negro, right? But we have proven that wrong. You guys hearing me, right? If you're new to the channel, make sure you catch up on the research in the last 8 years. So it has Amerindian ingredients, and stated it was only in the imponderable aspects of their culture differed from that of their Indian forebears. I emphasize the similarities to West Indian societies, suggesting it was not so much African as Afro-American culture. Dodge the hijack, see? That had penetrated the Amazonian culture. The earliest explorers called Carib, because working in Honduras about a decade after me, also has referred to the racial shift in St. Vincent and suggested that the Negro in parentheses element possessed a greater dynamism. So what is this Negro? That's what I'm trying to tell you. That's what I was just saying. We know there was so-called Negro Indians, if that's what you want to call them and describe them as, or people that look like what you would call Negro, right? In the Americas before Europeans arrived. And the Europeans themselves looked like Negroes. Let's be real specific and detailed and have a lot of context. Because look how they're debating their Africanness here. Because it's not part of the traditions or proof or any kind that they have. That's why they're debating it. But they're trying to say, oh, they're more Negro than Indians. What is it? Indians were Negro too. So make it make sense. That enabled the newly formed culture to thrive in ways that its immediate predecessor had not. But he did not further dwell on the Caribs' African past, thus the hijack. That hasn't been proven. Once I started working along these new lines, it seemed there was no end to new material on the Garifuna and their ancestors. And the more I learned, the more salient I considered the African background. Salient. Even as it became clear that the story was complex and the influence subtle. So again, just because of their so-called blackness, they're trying to make them African peoples only. Again, that's the hijacks, right? This part of the reading we're doing. It says African roots are fashionable now. Even in Central America, now it's fashionable. Now everybody's African. Afro-Costa Rican, Afro-Honduran, Afro-Panamanian, Afro this, Afro that. It's fashionable now. Although 20 years for that notion to fuse, it took time though, because the elders back in the day weren't saying that. This is the newer generations, all the Pan-Africanism stuff. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Make sure audio, yeah, okay. I don't see the chat moving at all. So the more I read and talked with elders in the field, the more I became convinced of my early view that the Caribs' ability to adapt individual behavior as well as social cultural rules and expectations to rapid change had been more of their most important characteristics for hundreds of years, even though at any given moment they will solemnly declare that what they do is what they have always done. I became increasingly uncomfortable with the idea that their modern social cultural system was direct descendant, with much of the outlines and detail intact of that of the island Caribs, descriptions of which we have only from the beginning of the 17th century onward. For the matter, there is considerable question as to how cohesive and distinct an ethnic category of the island Caribs were in themselves. Okay. Okay, so she's like, how Indian are they still? The Garifuna, right? So they have a lot of Indian in them, different types, not just Caribs too. It says studies of the contemporary Garifuna show without a doubt that ethnicity has become important to them, both as conscious value for its own sake and often unrealized by them as a means of improving their position within the modern complex societies in which they live. So all these people writing about them, huh? Inevitably, then, I began to think about the origins of the Garifuna sense of ethnicity and how it may have helped or hindered their efforts to survive. This book is an attempt to make sense of the various historical, archaeological, and ethnographic materials available that relate to the Garifuna and their ancestors. It is not intended to provide a systematic or exhaustive ethnography, rather it uses that methodology and perspective to explore certain social cultural problems. Okay, so this is what they write in the report on. The ethnogenesis of the modern Garifuna occurred on the Central American coastline in the 20th century. Linguistic, genetic, and ethnographic studies all document the Amerindian roots of these people. Okay? So this is what I'm trying to explain, guys. Like if anybody's having a problem, and this is again from all the research we've done. There's a lot of proof of their Indian side. And then when it comes to the so-called African, it's just based on the color, complexion. They try to say, oh, the language, all this, that could be indigenous languages too. You might be talking about some indigenous European dialects too, that they brought with them, the Black Europeans too. And when they're mixing with them and running away with them. But it is quite obvious too that there is an African component, quite obvious just because they color, right? Many casual observers have mistaken assured that Garifuna are of pure African descent just because of the looks, guys. Until recently, these people have been known as Black Caribs, a term that, despite its European origin, correctly denoted their Afro-American heritage. So you see what I'm saying? You got to dodge the hijack a lot. So so-called Black supposed to mean Afro. We can only speculate on the nature of the process by which the Amerindian and African became fused. They could only speculate, they could only conjecture, they could only make up false stories because the proof ain't there. But when you go into records and to real primary sources, like I was saying earlier, linguistic, genetic, and ethnographic studies document the Amerindian roots of these people. Plus, you get the Black Europeans coming over that you can also verify. So, what Africans? They could only speculate. Nevertheless, over the centuries, various writers have offered explanations of Black Carib origins, and with time, some of these have become generally accepted by both scholars and modern Garifuna, okay? They have become accepted, these theories out of Africa stuff. We will never know where or how these writers obtained their facts. Look, this author is telling you, how did they get all these facts? Because they're trying to Africanize them mainly. Indeed, until recently, most of them were untrained observers and amateur ethnographers, insufficiently critical of what they saw and heard. Not all of their observations and conclusions can be accepted at face value, okay? All right, I'm gonna highlight all this so you guys can remember this part. You gotta dodge the hijack. It's not just me telling you. I'm trying to, the research says a whole different story that we have shown. Yeah, you got it, man. Any more than we can accept unconditionally the oral traditions of the people themselves. Oh, the oral people says they're Indians. The trick, of course, is to combine all the possible sources in such a way that major contradictions are eliminated. That's what we did. The major contradiction is all these millions of Africans you said you brought. That's the major contradiction that which we excite of it. Plus, to understand who the Garifuna are today, I have sought ways to look more closely at their history and to trace the ethnogenesis of the peoples or cultures generally conceded to have been their direct ancestors. I refer here to the islands Caribs and their successors, the Black Caribs. The former are commonly believed to have come into being in the Lesser Antilles, when Carib-speaking peoples moved out of their Amazonian riverine homes to trade with and then conquer Arawak-speaking groups already living on the islands. Allaire, 1980, has pointed out quite rightly that this tradition told to Columbus by the people he first encountered and then recorded independently by the French missionary Raymond Breton has yet to be confirmed by archaeological investigation. In fact, Allaire suggests that the actual events may have been the other way around, that Arawak-speaking people, with the help of the earlier Spaniards, may have been encroaching upon the Caribs in the Lesser Antilles in the decades immediately following the European discovery. We have no clear evidence one way or the other at present, but undoubtedly we will have more in the future as increased attention is paid to the Caribbean area. The ill-fated Caliban, Kalina, or Galibi, from which cannibal derives, countered by the earliest Europeans, exhibited characteristics of each of the groups we have come to think as of Caribs and Arawaks. Their struggle to defend themselves and their islands were generally unsuccessful. The people and their culture nearly passed into oblivion, except for the fact that their name came to designate the American Mediterranean. The American Mediterranean, or Caribbean Sea. Mediterranean, huh? The real Mediterranean from ancient times, where the Mississippi empties into, right? The Sea of Egypt. Where's the true Mediterranean? The true Gold Coast. The term Carib has also lived on in many parts of South and Central America as a name for a language and for several different modern-day ethnic groups. It is arguable whether the island Caribs should be classed as a true ethnic group in the sense in which the term is commonly used today. That is, they were not integrated even marginally into any kind of plural society, though they certainly had consciousness of kind and a set of social and symbolic characteristics by which they differentiated themselves from others. Like so many other isolated, autonomous, preliterate societies, the island Caribs were, in their own eyes, simply the people. We the people. who apparently wanted nothing so much as to be left alone to govern themselves, even though they were infamous for their harassment of other peoples. Although they probably made pottery, there is still no agreement among archaeologists as to which, if any, of the several ceramic traditions known in the Caribbean may have belonged to them. Okay, so soon after their initial contact with Europeans, the island Caribs began to absorb the individuals. Listen, what did these island Caribs do? This is an important part. This is what I'm saying. What you think I'm just making things up? This is the stuff we find in people's genealogy. Okay? So soon after their initial contact with Europeans, the island Caribs began to absorb individuals, both Europeans, and they want to add the African because they're so-called black. So they got to try to say, well, they have to absorb the African somewhere because they're black. Because the Europeans couldn't be black, huh? But we know they were. We know the Indians were black. So the black can come from the Indian and the European. So they absorbed some Europeans, right? Captured or adopted from the new settlements, perhaps merely continuing an interactive pattern already established in relation to other groups of Amerindians. On some islands, notably St. Vincent, the amount of African intermixture, that's the hijack. These are black folks, for whatever Indians and Europeans intermixture was great enough to bring about a dramatic change in the phenotype. That's the hijack. By 1700s, perhaps earlier, a new society had emerged on St. Vincent that was racially and culturally distinct from that of the island Caribs, though undeniably related to it. This group achieved a self-conscious ethnic and political identity that depended on part upon the establishment of a new complex colonial society made up of island Caribs, listen, French and British colonial, religious and military bodies. Okay? And slaves belonging to all of the latter and all their slaves. So the island slaves, the French slaves, the British, so-called British, English, so-called British people, right? Military bodies, auxiliaries, they all had slaves as well, to all of the latter, as well as some free colored people, right? And a small group of maroons. Okay, this is what I'm saying. When you know all the background, a more truer background, you see that okay, so the African you want to add just because of color. Oh, these are all Africans, especially when you hear maroon or free colored, right? No, it's not. Okay, so get the context behind all this, you understand. That's what I'm saying. There's a lot in the Garifuna, heritage, but there's a lot of indigenous heritage in them as well, Although their rhetoric, as preserved in a few European records of the time, suggested that the Black Caribs, like their predecessors, merely wanted to be left alone, their actions showed them to be adapted to the idea and the reality of living in a world peopled by other distinct groups, some of which they manipulated to improve their own position. These Black Caribs, in turn, gave rise to the Garifuna some 200 years later. So the Garifuna are Black Caribs, right? The Garifuna are a transnational modern ethnic group whose members live under a variety of circumstances in several Central American countries, the United States, Canada, and England. Some are highly educated, sophisticated citizens of the world, while others are illiterate migrant laborers, farmers, and fishermen. Their use of distinctive and esoteric language and a sense of common origins holds them together. And in Honduras and Belize, at least, they are beginning to attract attention as a potentially important political force. Okay. And I just want to go to part 1 here. All right, we're just belly flopping so we can get through a little bit of it. It says here, part 1, ethnohistory. The term ethnohistory refers to attempts to trace the past of peoples with no formal written history. Such a state may come about because the people themselves have not yet developed or adopted literacy as a major value and are too isolated, this is their opinions right here, from a considered too unimportant by the literate segments of the society to which they belong to have had their culture documented. So for me, it's the paper genocide. It's why they don't, and then you told them they were all Africans. So What do you expect? It says if they speak an esoteric language, as is most often the case, this contributes to their historical isolation, for even after some of their members become literate in what will be them. Okay, so let's get to the part where they're talking about them. All right, again, we're live, so I appreciate you guys. All right, so here we go. So we'll go here, chapter 1, the Lesser Antilles, early European political history of St. Vincent. So we're gonna get a little background in history of St. Vincent here, right? So they're saying a lot of the Garifuna people came from this particular island in the Lesser Antilles, just so you understand. Okay. Says the story begins on St. Vincent, a small eastern Caribbean island of extraordinary beauty and fertility. The interior is mountainous, with many plains and well-watered valleys, which before the 19th century were covered with forests. The colonization of the islands by Europeans was typical of the Lesser Antilles. Spaniards were first to touch upon its shores, but finding neither pearls nor gold nor silver, they turned their attention to more lucrative conquests, right? When they say lucrative conquests, I know they're about to say it, but it's always the people, the slaves, the Indians. They became the money. Spaniards and island Caribs throughout the area, however, and that pattern extended to other European, sorry. So it says lucrative conquest. I skipped this part. It says some trading and a mutual slave raiding pattern were established between Spaniards and island Caribs throughout the area. However, and that pattern extended to other European and continued throughout the next 2 centuries, right? We're talking about Indian slavery. Has presented persuasive reasons for considering the Lesser Antilles and the Orinoco Amazon Basin on the South American mainland as a single conquest area. This was where they were conducting their slave raids, guys. This is where they're getting hundreds of thousands of slaves between the 16th and 18th centuries. Not Africa. Look, they're literally telling you right here. You know? You guys understand? I'm trying to, real history here. Real history. How many people we got? 62. A lot of people don't care about this. They'd rather be entertained with debates and people beefing with Pan-Africans or whatever the case, or whatever. So it says Burton in 1685 described St. Vincent Caribs trading food for iron tools with a handful of English settlers in the late 17th century. The island was less intruded upon than many others in the area at this time because a 1659 agreement between the English and French established it as Carib territory. Nevertheless, by the beginning of the 18th century, the French were regularly visiting the island from nearby Martinique, Grenada, and St. Lucia, where they had made successful settlements in 1635, 1649, and 1650, respectively, following unsuccessful British attempts on the latter 2 islands 2 generations earlier. On St. Vincent, the French quietly moved in on the leeward side during the first 2 decades of the 18th century, where they cultivated coffee, indigo, cotton, and cacao. They also raised livestock and cultivated provisions for trade to neighboring French islands where sugarcane predominated and food supplies were scarce. Living for the most part on small holdings, the French settlers seem to have gotten along well with the local inhabitants, so-called French. Who are these French, right? Though there were some initial problems when the Indians believed the French intended to enslave them. Oh yeah, they intended to enslave them for sure, because they weren't enslaving Africans. After the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, the English escalated their visits to and explorations of the island, though they did not succeed in establishing a colony. Uren in 1726 found when he visited in 1722 that some of the Indians already spoke French. Why did the Indians speak French? They had mixed maybe, and that considerable intermixture with Africans. What Africans? So we're talking about French. You mean with the black French, with Huguenots or somebody else who was also black and they intermixing with them. Now you're trying to make them black and you're trying to make them African just because they're black, right? They're crayon colors now, and now they're just from Africa. In fact, at that time, there appeared to have been 2 politically separate groups, the Black Caribs, led by a chief, and the Red or Yellow Caribs, led by a general. Splitting by color now. In 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle attempted to establish once again an Indian territory, declaring the islands of St. Vincent, Dominica, St. Lucia, and Tobago to be neutral. This agreement among European nations, obviously made to keep each other at bay, was not formally rescinded until 1763, when the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and the French-Spanish coalition was terminated. At that time, the Treaty of Paris ceded the islands of St. Vincent, Dominica, Tobago, Grenada, and the Grenadines to England, while Guadeloupe and Martinique reverted to France, along with the formerly neutral St. Lucia. It was at this time that the British became serious about establishing sugar plantations on St. Vincent. Again, so when we talk about sugar plantations, the people who were really doing that was Sephardic, the crypto Jews. They were the experts in that, so-called English, right? Establishing so-called English. In spite of the earlier neutrality agreements, the French had maintained and expanded their clandestine settlements, and by 1763 they had thoroughly ingratiated themselves with the natives. All right, with the natives, ingratiated themselves with the natives, the majority of whom by now were referred to as black. The natives were referred to as black. So, and we know it wasn't Africans that were coming. So where's the black coming from? That's what I'm trying to explain to you guys. There was so-called black Indians. So it didn't have to always come from outside. All right, you guys listening, you're watching, we got 56 people that care. Okay, let's keep going. Maybe one day people will listen or want to learn this stuff. Between 1764 and 1770, the British surveyed and mapped the island of St. Vincent and tried by category intimidation and forced to remove the Caribs from their extensive and fertile lands. French-speaking liaisons arranged dubious purchases, often for what were admitted by the British to be trifling sums. All accounts refer to the natives involved in such purchases as being black. Oh man, we can't make this up, guys. This is what I'm saying. Like, they want to, they know they got nothing to say they came from Africa. So all accounts again refer to the natives involved in such purchases as being black, so-called black. Yeah, y'all are in here. That's what's up. Thank you. Appreciate y'all. There is no evidence of similar machinations vis-a-vis and the yellow or red Caribs, and it is likely that by this time they were either allies and brothers of the former, or, if independent, so few in number as to pose little competition to threat to the British. All right, so they're calling all these people black, yellow, the red ones, the black ones, all the crayon colors. In the events that followed, it is not clear whether the Caribs or the British were more duplicitous. Certainly, each side was highly motivated, and both were experienced and skilled negotiators, but their system of diplomacy and warfare differed, and there were ups and downs for both sides before the British finally prevailed. By 1772, there was open warfare due to the escalating tensions caused by insistent British encroachment upon Carib territory and defiance of the latter's demonstrances and threats of violence. Remonstrances. Wow. Remonstrances. I don't think I've ever read out that word before in my life. And threats of violence. But I know what they kind of mean. After calming the Caribs by bringing in troops from Boston. Troops from Boston, are those all white folks? Troops from Boston and the British signed a treaty with them in which the Caribs lost all but about 4,000 acres in the northeastern, example, windward part of the island. Okay, so that's pretty deep right there. You know, we're talking about 1700s, right? What troops were coming in? That could include Indians from New England. It could include black Europeans, you know, black folks fighting black folks. The Caribs, they lost all but 4,000 acres in that time. The British Land Survey in 1763 found nearly 700 French settlers with some 3,400 slaves occupying about 7,000 acres of land on St. Vincent, mostly on the southwestern part of the island. Many of these people elected to stay where they were, believing the new government would build roads and provide greater trading opportunities, thus improving their lot. They were permitted to retain their lands by lease if they declared allegiance to Britain. Yet they chafed finding their new English neighbors and government demanding and difficult. So in 1779, when France again declared war on Britain, the unhappy French and Caribs seized St. Vincent with help from French troops sent over from Martinique. In spite of a devastating hurricane in 1780 and a smallpox epidemic that killed many Caribs shortly thereafter. That it goes oh, they died by disease. Oh yeah, you sure you didn't enslave a lot of them? The French Carib domination on St. Vincent lasted for 4 years. At that time, there were said to be, in addition to several thousand Caribs, 500 whites, so-called whites, Europeans, right, 7,000 to 8,000 slaves living on the island. Most of the increase in the number of slaves was probably due to British demands for workers for sugar cultivation, was far more labor-intensive than coffee and cacao production. Although most of the British settlers remained and even prospered during this period of French Carib domination, they were generally harassed by the Caribs, no doubt with the full approval of the French. The Caribs harassing the English, they were the minority. Yes, that's what's up. Shout out to the chat, the live chat. Yeah. By 1783, when the island was again formally returned to Great Britain, it was said to include 61 English sugar estates and an unspecified number of smaller farms. Depended upon the St. Vincent government, where several smaller islands were produced and cotton were grown for export. These included Bequia, Union, Canoane, Mustique, Petite, Martinique, Petite Saint Vincent, Maleru, and Balisux. By 1790, the inhabitants of these islands numbered 1,450 Europeans and 11,853 slaves, 1,600 of the latter living on the dependent islands. Thus, the European population had nearly tripled between 1775 and 1790, in spite of their problems with the Caribs. Estimates of the Carib population varied widely, but 7,000 to 8,000 seems not unreasonable, given known figures for captives of the 1795 to 96 so-called Carib War and estimates of battle mortality. Accounts of the Carib War are numerous. Not unexpectedly, most reveal the bias of the writer, although some accounts are more sympathetic to the plight of the indigenous people than others. All assume that the Europeans had as much or more right as the Caribs to live on the islands. As happened in so many parts of the world, the British assumed the Caribs had far more land than they needed or could use. All right, they taken the land. Thus, as in North America, the British felt, all right, perfectly justified in requesting, demanding, and finally seizing Carib lands in the name of the British king. It did not occur to them that the Caribs might themselves aspire to production for export, even though at least 2 and probably more chiefs were said to have plantations of their own. They had their own plantations. Listen, the Indians, worked by slaves, black Caribs. They had plantations with slaves. Miller, after the most complete search of the documentary evidence of St. Vincent yet made, has asserted that by 1763 the Carib economy was far above subsistence level. The British also assumed that all societies had a maximal authority vested in a single individual, and they persisted in making treaties with the person they thought was in charge, or the one they appointed to be in charge, holding the entire group responsible when others refused to adhere to these agreements. Actually, the pre-conquest island Caribs did conduct internecine raids against each other, led by their war chiefs, and their successors among the black Caribs may have wielded more authority in the last quarter of the 18th century than has been supposed. In part, this may have been a social-cultural development in response to the almost constant skirmishing with the British after 1763. The fact that the British Gaulle was recognized as such by some authorities, even at that time, is shown in the account of Valentine Morris, Captain General and Governor-in-Chief of St. Vincent in the fateful year of 1779, when the French-Carib alliance retook the island. He noted that when the 1772 treaty with the Caribs had been signed, there had been no English official present who spoke either the Carib language or French, and that the Caribs spoke no English. Only one purchaser, Lieutenant Colonel Etherington, one of the commanders of the troops from Boston, operating on his own behalf, was able to communicate with them at all. Chatoyer, a name that was repeatedly mentioned as the Carib king or principal chief, Chatoyer, the Carib king, at that time alleged later that he and the other chiefs had never meant to do more than lease a few acres of their land. Certainly they had not meant to sell it. You see, the land got taken, and they tried to say they were, hey, no, they sold it to us, but they never did. As they were later told, the papers upon which each had placed his X indicated. In spite of his doubts, however, Morris concluded that the Caribs were lying and only wanted their lands back after having spent the money paid them. Now, you guys hear that? That's dirty. That's messed up. Papers preserved in British archives show that the idea of removing the Caribs from St. Vincent entirely had been seriously considered. That was part of the plan. As early as 1772, even before any treaty had been signed, and in spite of the fact that numerous military reports stated that the Caribs were quiet and had made no efforts to prepare themselves for their own defense, right? In a later date, April 18, 1772, the Earl of Hillsborough told the governor of St. Vincent, if necessity demand the removal of the Caribs or Caribs, you do take up such vessels as can be procured and served as transport, for the conveyance of them to some unfrequented part of the coast of Africa. Wow. Body bag for the illusion. All right, so first of all, let's break this down. They're saying, oh, nah, they want their land back because they spent their money. Nah, we're not giving it. They sold it to us. That was a lie. The Indians said, nah, we loaned it. We leased it to them, so they can survive. Not like, hey, you own it, They never gave it to them, right? And then even before that, they try to say that's the reason they took their land because they sold it. But even before any treaties or any purchases or any whatever contracts, they were already putting in writing. They were already putting in writing, as we just read, that they were going to remove the Caribs. And do what? Transport them. Look, listen, to serve as transports for the conveyance of them to some unfrequented part of the coast of Africa. Send them to Africa. Send them to West Africa. Send them to West Africa. It's into Africa. History, not out of Africa. You understand? Oh, now they're Africans. Now you take a DNA test and now you got a relationship to some people in Africa. You guys see what they're telling you right here. They got taken there as slaves, right? Black Caribs. So where are the Caribs over there in Africa? What do they look like? On the coast of Africa, huh? Or to some desert island adjacent there too. Or to Cape Verde. Or to St. Thomas, Cape Verde Islands. Care being taken that they be treated on the voyage with every degree of humanity their situation will admit of, and whatsoever may be judged necessary, to subsist them for a reasonable time, and with such tools and implements as may enable them to provide for their future subsistence. 25 years later, almost to this day, similar instructions landed the Caribs on the island of Roatan, listen, off the coast of Honduras. They got relocated to the island of Roatan off the coast of Honduras, okay? Who are all these people? They try to say they're African today. They try to Africanize all these people today, guys. I want you to remember there's a history here written. And when you start going into records and records and records and you keep digging, you're not going to find any ships going from Africa over here, but you're going to find it the other way around, as it just told us. And these people being relocated to other parts of the Americas and to Europe. Thus, we see that the deportation of 1797 had been seriously considered for some time and was not merely in revenge for Carib acts committed in desperation during the Carib War of 1795 to 96. See, because they were trying to say, no, these are prisoners of war because they're going to war against us. No, they only went to war against you guys because they had desperation during that time because you guys were killing them and enslaving them, right? As was frequently suggested by apologists at that time. It must also be remembered that the Caribs had an alliance during that war with the French mulatto, the French mulatto revolutionary Victor Hughes. This is what I'm trying to tell you about the French. You're saying they pale skin? This guy's being called the mulatto, just so you can know. Just so you know, because you can't hide him from history. He was mulatto, by the way. Mulatto, the mulatto French Victor Hughes, a serious and formidable enemy of the British and of the entire slave buttressed colonial system. Hugh and his men reinforced the Caribs from their stronghold of St. Lucia. All right, a black European helping them, okay? And after that island was taken by the British in September 1795, he sent supplies and men to St. Vincent from the main center of French military operations at Guadeloupe. Even though the primary concern of the St. Vincent planters was to obtain the Carib lands, they and the British government were also frightened by the repercussions in the West Indies of the French Revolution, including the rebellions and eventual revolution in Haiti. They were afraid, all right, because that was an indigenous rebellion in general. That what happened in Haiti, all right. It was feared that British slaves throughout the area would be influenced to revolt, and by 1795 there were enough of them of St. Vincent to have created real havoc had that happened. But the latter spoke no French and had neither island-wide leaders nor centralized social organization, thus without knowing or understanding the broader situation. Most of the slaves remained faithful to their British masters. Also, as Turnbull and Edwards noted, competition between Caribs and slaves to sell their produce in the local markets increased the animosity between the groups, between the slaves and Caribs, Details of the final stages of the war have been described elsewhere. I will simply note that the Caribs with arms, ammunition, and other supplies furnished by the French fought fiercely alongside what? So-called white, so-called black, and mulatto Frenchmen. Okay? All right? Body bag. Who? Black Frenchman, huh? Black Frenchman. You thought I was making it up. I didn't write this book. Black Frenchman, mulatto, so-called white, fair, huh? Light skin, so-called white, black Frenchman, huh? I thought they were all supposed to be pale skin. That's what you told me when I was growing up in school. That's what you told me, teacher. That all these people were the white man. So they fought along with other black Europeans, right? The Caribs collectively turned brigands. The brigands, the black French brigands, or sometimes carmagnolis. We got future videos on all this. After a song that was popular at the time of the French Revolution, the stakes for the French were clearly more than the small island of St. Vincent, and the Caribs undoubtedly were ignorant of what was happening in Europe, where France was undergoing massive internal change and was threatening the British Isles as well. The end of 1796 was said to have been the low point of the war from the British perspective. The British had a superior military position on St. Vincent because they controlled the only good harbor and port facilities at Kingston, and they finally overwhelmed their enemy by sheer numbers, nearly 4,000 troops having been sent to the island to bolster British forces. But the story of what happened after the formal French Carib surrender on June 10th, 1796 is less well known. So what happened to all these French, these black French and Caribs, right? What happened when they lost? That is less well known. And information recently discovered in the War Office records in England suggests some new interpretations. Upon surrender, the French were accorded the standard treatment for prisoners of war and deported to Guadeloupe. Deported to Guadeloupe as slaves and thence to Europe as slaves, huh? Some of those who were resident on the island were permitted to stay after they declared allegiance to the British. The Caribs, however, were required to surrender unconditionally, which for them meant loss of their entire homeland, okay? Listen, their culture, perhaps their lives, right? Their culture, their identity, perhaps their lives, their history. In fact, as early as 1772, the Caribs had insisted that they would never submit, never give up their lands, preferring to die first. Thus, when they refused to surrender, they were hunted down without mercy. Over 1,000 of their houses and 200 canoes were burned. Their crops were destroyed. Their stores of food were confiscated. Starvation and disease took their toll as the summer wore on. By October 1796, 4,195 black Caribs, plus 44 slaves said to belong to them. They had slaves, huh? Black Caribs had slaves, huh? To them. Or could they just be family, indentured to them? And 102 so-called yellow Caribs had been captured. So-called yellow, the lighter one, had been captured and sent to Balisouks. They had been what? Even the yellow ones, right? Even the yellow ones have been what? Captured and sent to Balisouks as slaves. Balisouks as slaves. All right, real quick. Balisouks. I'm guessing that's in France, right? Where is Balisouks? Oh, actually, it's a Caribbean island. Balisouks is a show map of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Let me see. Balisouks is a small Caribbean island and is one of the Grenadines chain of islands, okay? They got sent to Balisouks. And all of those in the last two categories were later returned to St. Vincent and then returned. Between October 1796 and March 1797, some 2,400 interned Caribs died of a mysterious malignant fever. Oh yeah? Or were they enslaved and sold as Negroes? Most probably either typhus or yellow fever. The impact was aggravated, without doubt, by malnutrition. The Caribs' death rate was 85% compared to reported rate of only 5% for the British slaves and Negro troops. And Negro troops, huh? Oh, Negro troops. Wait, you said you got them from Boston. Oh, you mean the Boston troops were Negro troops? Which one is it? Let's see the sources. Who are you talking about? Actually, the death rate for yellow fever among military troops and civilians in the Caribbean at that time was really much higher. And it is possible that the lower rate recorded for non-Caribs on Balisouks was due to the fact that most of the troops stationed there, like the slaves, had been recruited directly from Africa, dodged the hijack. Where? 1979 said that? Where they have acquired immunity. Oh, they will. Oh, you would have. Now you're guessing. Would have acquired. So they're African because they didn't die of the disease. You hear what they're saying? Debunk me on this. What sources does Buckley have that they're from Africa, other than, oh, they survived, they had immunity. That's why they would have. He's guessing. Would have. The symptoms, causes, and treatments of yellow fever or bull's fever, as it was sometimes called, were extremely controversial, even among the leading medical authorities of the time. But between 1793 and 1796, about 80,000 cases of yellow fever were reported in the area, of which about one half resulted in death. Slave owners on St. Vincent, as part of the damages they claimed from the British government after the reduction of the Caribs, their enslavement, their relocation, their murder. A large sum for slaves lost through epidemical disease, a large sum for slaves. Lewis has noted that the primary killer on British naval personnel between 1793 and 1815 was fever, especially yellow fever and typhus, and the description of the disease that struck St. Vincent and Balisouks in 1796 seems to match the symptoms of typhus, even though typhus is generally thought not to occur in the tropics. There was an epidemic reported in Barbados in 1795. Some medical historians, however, believe the diagnosis was mistaken and that it was likely yellow fever. We shall probably never know for sure. Whatever the microorganism responsible, it is interesting that the Garifuna oral tradition has not preserved the horrors of this epidemic, other than to assert that the British poisoned many of their people by mixing lime with their flour. No doubt the awful symptoms of the disease, so often followed in just a few days by death, must have seemed like poison in the absence of other experience. Even the attendant British physician was unable to account for what he saw. What was the maximum number of Caribs who ever lived on St. Vincent? All right. Oh yeah, they don't want to know. No, they don't want to give the numbers. They definitely don't want to give the numbers because they're like, whoa, 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 wait, you enslaved and killed that many? The accounts vary, as Miller has shown that Europeans observers were never very clear as to which groups they were discussing, and figures were always mere guesses. However, given the number of Caribs who surrendered, and judging by accounts of battle casualties as well as allowing for deaths before they surrendered, I believe that 7,000 to 8,000 estimate given earlier is reasonable. So, you know, look at this is hijacked too. This could be way off. It could be hundreds of thousands, or at least 50,000, right? 70,000, 80,000, right? Contrary to what has been suggested by Taylor and G. Gulick, the Black Caribs seem not to have reached the limits of their resource base, although they certainly had begun to perceive of their surroundings as being somewhat crowded. And the constant pressure to give up more and more of their land would have placed them in a defensive and aggressive position. Ethnological and psychological theories lead us to expect that internal political, disputes, whatever their motivation, would have been exacerbated under such crowding. Furthermore, the need to cooperate in the face of the European threat might have countered centrifugal tendencies. On March 3rd, 1797, under the supervision of Major John Wilson of the 7th West Indian Regiment, the Caribs were boarded. All right, what happens? They were put on a ship. Hey, welcome, welcome if you just joined, welcome. And on March 11th, they sailed from the Lesser Antilles in a convoy made up of 8 or 9 ships. Listen, they were put on ships, 8 or 9 of them at least, commanded by Captain John Barrett in the flagship Experiment. Some of these on board were still sick, and others apparently were left behind if they seemed too weak to withstand the trip. Even so, many more died on the passage itself. What passage? Where did they go? The British considered several different sites before they decided upon Bay Islands. Among others, these included Africa. Listen, guys, a lot of these people sent to Africa the other way around. The Bahamas, the peninsula of Samana, on the island of Hispaniola, right? Remember what they said? Oh, they needed to replenish the local slave population, the indigenous population, because they all died out with other slaves from Africa, but they were bringing a lot of Indians from other parts of Americas into Hispaniola. Okay, here's another example. The Black Caribs. Black, right? Black Caribs. People who they would be calling Negro today, or African American, or Afro Carib, or Afro this, Afro that, as slaves to Hispaniola. All right. So this is all these places they were taking them, right? It is important to note that upon their surrender, the Caribs were classified according to color. The British sending the yellow, lighter-skinned people back to St. Vincent. Listen what they're doing. They're separating the Caribs, even if they might be related. They're separating them by color, by shade of complexion. The British sending the yellow or lighter-skinned people back to St. Vincent, thus perhaps separating members of families. Come on now. Oh man, we can't make this up, man. And we got many testimonies of this in North America as well, guys. People's history, black folks I'm talking about. Look what they're doing, guys. They are creating a separation, a so-called white superiority idea, a race. It was assumed that the lighter Caribs were of a different political and ethnic group than the blacks, and basically benign. I have found no definitive answer to whether there were 1 or 2 political groups by that time, but I have seen no evidence of negotiations with any organized or informal separate group identified as Yellow Caribs. It may be that the two were ethnically separate but united temporarily against a common oppressor. Alexander Anderson, a resident botanist who visited the Carib territory in the island just before the final war, believed there were no more than 2 or 3 families of pure-blooded Yellow Caribs left. After the deportation, arms and ammunition were found in the huts of some of these so-called Yellow Caribs, leading the British to alter their former view of them. Such evidence is hardly decisive, but it does suggest they were ready to defend themselves against whatever enemy came along. The die had been cast. However, and the lighter-skinned people were returned to St. Vincent, even though many Vincentian planters urged that they too be sent to Honduras. Send them to Honduras too. In spite of subsequent speculation, there was no evidence that further deportations to Roatan or Central America occurred. Within a few years, all Caribs remaining on St. Vincent were pardoned and granted lands, although they were explicitly denied the right to participate in political affairs. It is not known how many Caribs remained after the original deportation, but judging by later clues, their number was not trivial and must have included many black Caribs that are still there, guys. Okay, so don't just think, oh, they only left behind light skin. No, it's still that they would call black Caribs, as well as those labeled yellow or red. All right, you see, separating people by color like they're doing in all over the world. And they didn't see themselves like that, guys. They didn't separate themselves like that. All right. So many died in the eruption of Mount Soufriere in 1812, and others fled to Trinidad following that incident. Yet by 1833, there were said to be about 1,000 Caribs on the island. Although Ober said there were only about 600 Caribs on both St. Vincent and Dominica at the time of his visit in the 1880s. Some 2,000 were reported to have died at the time of the next major eruption of Soufriere. Wow, volcanoes in 1902. Part of the problem in counting them was that their culture and whatever ethnic identity they may have had at the time of the deportation were soon largely destroyed or submerged as this small group gradually became assimilated into the general post-emancipation black population. Oh man, now you just black. They got what assimilated? Now everybody's just black. Now everybody's just Negro. Now everybody's just African American. Now everybody just came from Africa and everybody was just slaves. You see? Today, although there is a sense of being somewhat different from the rest and their self-identification as Caribs is explicit, little survives of their language, religion, music, or crafts. Thus, it has been difficult to distinguish them from their neighbors in spite of contemporary attempts to revive some of the old ways. In 1985, a film about the Caribs of Dominica was released, entitled Last of the Carapuna, or Carafuna. Carafuna, see, Garifuna, Carafuna. It featured an interview with the young chief of the group who had been educated in the United States, where by his own admission, he was deeply influenced by the Native American rights movement. All right. Yeah. All right, we're gonna continue. Since we're here. You guys enjoying the reading? It says Carib culture history on St. Vincent. Several archaeologists have done surveys on St. Vincent over the past 70 or so years, but their publications cast very little light on the way of life of the so-called island Caribs. Fuchs reported evidence of a sedentary culture on St. Vincent before the arrival of the Caribs. Presumably, these were the Igneti or true Arawak speakers before the Caribs arrived. Those people lived for the most part on the leeward, western side of the island, especially wherever there were convenient landing places or where valleys opening to the sea presented available land. Although Fuchs also found several midden on the windward side. Middens, considerable pottery of distinctive designs, was found, some with animal heads as handles or legs. Joyce 1916 and Love in 1935 used travelers' accounts as well as archaeological material to depict the pre-conquest culture of St. Vincent. Both mentioned fishhooks, and Lovin described three-pronged arrows for shooting fish or crustaceans, as well as harpoons with detachable points for hunting sea turtles. Fuchs recovered a harpoon and several fishhooks. He also found shallow burials, including pottery and other items of daily use, at Balisux, and speculated that he had discovered the site of the 1796 to 97 Black Carib interment. Bullen and Bullen, because there was an adequate historical information available to them, cast doubt on this interpretation. They assumed that only a small percentage of the Black Caribs captured had been quartered on Balisux. We now know there were massive deaths among both Caribs and Black and white soldiers during their stay on the island. So it would be strange if there were not some evidence of that ordeal. The Bullens never excavated on St. Vincent, but their work on what they believed to be a Carib site on St. Lucia as well as information from numerous surveys on other islands suggest the Caribs, in contrast to Arawaks, preferred high, windswept promontories overlooking the sea. The Bullens inferred that the Carib culture was better able to exploit the marine resources of the windward coast than was that of their predecessors, perhaps because their canoes and knowledge of the sea were superior. Who are the Caribs? Who are the Carians? Ancient Phoenicians? Who's all these seafaring ancient people? What do they have to do with Caribs? A lot. We've gone over it. They were superior, huh? The knowledge of the sea. Most scholars have tended to agree with this interpretation, even though they may disagree with the Bullen's assertion that the Swazi ceramic complex correlates with the historical island Carib culture. So Hag, following Rouse, is adamant that until historic Carib and or Arawak sites can be identified through archival work followed by archaeological excavation, we should refrain from labeling materials by one another term. It says, nevertheless, because Swazi is the latest pre-European pottery found in the Lesser Antilles, it is reasonable to suppose it was made by the people encountered by Columbus and the other early explorers and missionaries, whatever they were called and wherever they may have come from. While archaeological evidence for early Black Carib livings patterns is non-existent, the Bullens did find a distinctive pottery on St. Vincent they termed peasant ware, which they associated with Black Caribs, for reasons they failed to outline. The question of who made the pottery throughout the entire period is crucial, given the assumption that men were the primary newcomers in both the transition from Arawak to Carib and from island Carib to Black Caribs. Oh, that's the hijack. A layer suggests it may have been men, but most scholars assume it was women, in which we should not expect such major stylistic changes, since mythology suggests a continuity of females throughout the various conquests. Questions concerning the associations between known complexes in time and space are rife but unresolved. In any case, the people may have begun to use some imported European ware by 1750. Further archaeological work must include a historical component, and comparisons with slave-quartered remains may also be instructive. The earliest useful descriptions we have of life among the Caribbeans on St. Vincent comes from the pens of 17th century French and English explorers and Jesuit priests. It is important to note, however, that only Breton and perhaps Laborde spent any significant amount of time living in close relations with the Indians. Unfortunately, by the time these Europeans came to document the customs of the islanders, the latter had already been in contact with Europeans, and especially, they're saying Africans, they're saying different types of Black folks, right? Especially with what Africans? What are you talking about? Black Europeans, Black Indians? For several generations, they're trying to say they were already Black by then. They've been Black. As we shall see, this requires us to examine more carefully the apparent parallels between Carib, Arawak, and they're saying African customary practices and beliefs. All right, that's the hijack. What are they basing the African off? They're only basing it off the color, guys. That's not scholarly. You're just basing it off color. Some or many of them may turn out to be syncretisms. Yeah, you're seeing it in reverse. America's a true old world. A lot of the practices in West Africa originated in the Americas. In Melville Herskovic's original sense of the term, rather than independent invention, products of similar adaptive processes of the psychic unity. All right, so yeah, go read his thing. So it is generally thought that the first Africans reached St. Vincent in 1635. It was its first thought, right? They conjecture, they lie to us. When 2 Spanish slave boats were wrecked in the vicinity. We're gonna have to do a video on that and debunk this, guys. Just like I did the Barbados one. I debunk all these stories, the 1619 one, the one from the 1500s. I debunk all this stuff, right? We're gonna look into this so-called slave ship, right? Or slaves who wrecked. There's always some slave ship that was wrecked in the vicinity. That's the same story everywhere. But we're gonna verify that. So, yet Dominican Caribs frequently raided European settlements between 1558 and 1580. We got Carib pirates, okay? Indian Carib Dominican pirates, raided European settlements between 1558 and 1580, taking both so-called whites and blacks as slaves. Everybody, didn't matter about the color. Who's these whites? Who's these so-called blacks? Give me some names. I bet you they're just saying whites because they're Europeans. Blacks, who's the blacks? It is likely that St. Vincent Caribs were similarly engaged and had at least some contact with Africans. Some contact, what? Those are how they're guessing, several generations before 1635 shipwreck. A young Spanish black woman kept captive on Dominica before 1574 reported later that the island Caribs there had more than 30 Spaniards and some 40 black slaves, all right? She's a black Spanish woman, okay? So reported a complaint by Martiniquan planters that more than 500 of their slaves had been kidnapped by Caribs from nearby islands. Some of these may have been ritually killed and eaten as war captives, but most were probably absorbed into Carib society, perhaps as slaves, probably. Now you're saying eating, now he's making up things. The male captives were encouraged to cohabit with Carib women, and their progeny were accepted as full-fledged Caribs. You hear that? So slaves of any kind, even if it can be black Europeans, they were accepted as full-fledged Caribs. The male captives were encouraged to cohabit with Carib women, even live with some Carib women, have some babies with them. Listen, okay, oh, I'm Carib, Kurimeo, I'm Garifuna. I'm like, all right, well, you might have some black European too. Trust me. It is possible that the Europeans reporting on this matter mistook a kind of bride service for chattel slavery of the sort they themselves practiced. Because Africans would probably have found life more probably have found more life familiar and terrible among the Caribs. Probably, yeah, you're making up stuff. So slaves of any kind, probably, right, would have found life more familiar, any slave from black Europeans or other Indians, tolerable among the Caribs than among other Europeans, even under the yoke of slavery. Distances, currents, and winds are such in the area that escaping slaves could easily have reached St. Vincent in small craft from other islands, as their descendants were known to do in later times. Breton, Rochefort, and Labat described in varying details the language, physical appearance, dress, and adornment, housing, diet, diversions, life crisis, rites, and religious practices of the island Caribs in this early period. The most salient characteristic considered astounding by most observers was that the men and women spoke different languages, the first being of Carib origin, and the latter Arawak. Okay, the men spoke Carib, the women more Arawak. What does that mean? That means that they had been invaded by the Caribs before, and the men killed, right? And then they started producing or mixing with the women, and that's why the women. This is what's happening, guys. The Caribs did that a lot. Okay, supposedly Carib conquerors coming out of the Orinoco, right, South America, about a century before Columbus, had taken the Arawak wives, who had perpetuated their own language among their children. In later years, as the boys spent more time with their fathers, they also became fluent in Carib, while the girls suffered along speaking only Arawak. While remnants of this male-female linguistic distinction survive, it is clearly Arawak that has won out, forming the basis of the language today known as an island Carib, which in turn underlies Central American Carib. Okay, you guys hear that? The latter has incorporated a large number of loan words from French, and they also borrow from French, Spanish, and English, and Mosquito, the island Carib language, which is mostly Arawak with French, Spanish, English, and Mosquito. Recently, Taylor and Huff, following Gomerville, have suggested that the men's language of the 17th century was actually a Carib pidgin language spoken widely in the islands and on the mainland. This provides a more satisfying explanation for its persistence among the men who traveled widely then. So it was a pidgin language for like trade. You know how they have people have the same language for trade all over different places, right? Just like in the Southeast US. This provides a more satisfying explanation, right? It's saying, for our purposes, it is interesting to note that, like Amazonian Central Arawaks, the earliest island Caribs lived in round houses, rather than the rectangular ones known during later colonial and modern times. in that they had separate public houses where the menfolk congregated and slept in, which were used for feasts, like public houses where men were separated, probably only separated the women during their menstrual or when somebody died or something, just like the Israelites, just like we read yesterday. Ha! And for public feasts, right? Neither the historical nor the archaeological record is clear as to when rectangular houses with square corners became the norm, since men traditionally have been the house builders nearly everywhere. It is tempting to speculate that this was an early, so look at that. They're saying, I don't know when they started switching their houses. It was probably when the Africans came because we didn't do that. You see what they're saying? It's tempting to speculate that this was an early African modification. Maybe it was the Africans who did that. No, maybe it was the Black Europeans who brought that idea. Archaeologists place a good deal of emphasis on house shape and style as being diagnostic of ethnic status. Thus, one wonders how and under what circumstances such a major stylistic change might have occurred. The point is especially intriguing because much of the other Carib domestic material culture is even today almost identical to that found among Carib and Arawak speakers in Amazonia. Although the island's Caribs had canoes, some as large as schooners, and were accomplished on long-distance travel, it is important to note that these slaves coming from the Gold Coast were also accomplished fishermen and extremely adept at making large canoes. Among the items destroyed by the British after the Carib War were many large canoes, some said to hold 50 persons, and of dimensions never heard of before. All right, so look, guys, now we're going into like videos we've done where we went over primary sources reporting the ships, not canoes, but large ships, just like Phoenicians. You guys understand that, like the Viking ships and the Phoenician ships, they were literally like big ass canoes. They were from one large tree, cut out of one large tree. They were large. These ships were literally large canoes. The Indians had stuff like that, guys, like the Phoenician ships with sails and everything, like the Viking ships with sails and everything. The Indians had this. As they're saying here, some of them in dimensions never heard of before. We've got, accounts by Columbus with people with 200 men on them. 200 men, how can you fit that in a canoe? Come on now. They want you to think little canoe. They want you to think Americans weren't seafarers, ancient seafarers who taught the world how to seafare. So again, they had many large canoes, so-called canoes. Like their ancestors, the Garifuna today are known for their skill in making canoes, constructing some as large as 5 feet across and 30 feet long. McCusick dates the use of sails to 1608, when a Spanish friar claimed to have saved his own life by teaching the islanders how to manufacture and use sprit sails, a type of fore and aft arrangement. All right, so that's a lie because, again, that's in 1608. We got Columbus in the 1400s, 1490s, and 1500s writing that he saw the Mayas and all these people and all these different people in the Caribbean with sails, with ships, large canoes with sails, okay? We've already debunked this. This is what I'm saying, guys. In spite of the somewhat apocryphal nature of this story, I have found nothing among the scanty data on sails to contradict it, all right? Yeah, he hasn't, but we have. We have. He didn't check the Columbus journals. That was the very first journals he should have checked, right? Nicholson accepted the story, but emphasizes that the speeds and distances reported for early Carib seafarers were made possible not by the use of sails, but by their technique of using as many as 24 men paddling at one time. Again, paddling just like the Vikings and Phoenician ships, with sails too, though. One time, thus freeing them from dependency upon the elements and allowing them to proceed for long distances without rest or sleep. Again, just like Vikings, just like Phoenicians, so-called Phoenician ships. According to the chroniclers, pottery was manufactured by island Caribs, women on St. Vincent, although there is no mention of it for Black Caribs, during the final period before or just after the deportation. Clay griddles, so common in archaeological sites, has been replaced by iron ones, at least by 1787. Indeed, Burton said the Caribs were already trading for iron tools. Iron. Caribs were trading iron. They said we didn't have iron and equipment shortly after the mid-17th century. Other ceramic items may have continued to be made, even in Central America, though perhaps with a sharp decline in quality and quantity when English glass and stoneware became more generally available. To date, we have not been able to distinguish any foreign types among the redwares available in Honduras. In the early 19th century, both island and black Carib men made basketry items, including the special equipment needed to extract the poisonous juice, hydrocyanic acid, from bitter manioc and to process it for consumption. Baskets of Carib style and design were adopted by the slave population and continued to be made and used in St. Vincent and Dominica until recently. That's funny. By the slave population. Why would they adopt it? They are the Caribs, a lot of them. The slave population, a lot of them were the so-called black Caribs, black Indians, right? Until recently, right? These baskets, as well as some other items manufactured by men such as silkgrass, fish lines and hammocks, and wooden kitchen dishes were also in demand among Europeans. All right, among Europeans. Both men and women had important roles in agriculture. The men cleared and burned the gardens for which women were then largely responsible. In a lot of the indigenous traditions, the women are the ones growing the food. Women were active in local marketing, while men traded to nearby islands. Hunting, fishing, and warfare were the main occupations of the island Caribs men. It is noteworthy since it is not usually mentioned that the black Caribs at least did not live exclusively on the seacoast as the Garifuna do today, but also inland along the rivers, which provided them with their major fish supply. All English accounts of St. Vincent between 1763 and 1797 describe Carib villages and hamlets as being scattered inland, as well as on the windward coast. The records are not so clear for the red or yellow Caribs. We only know they were concentrated on the western or leeward side of the island before 1763. Rochefort, 1666, described in some detail the activities of shamans who could invoke the spirits of the dead to give advice to or cure the living. He reported that frequent feasts were held at which cassava or pineapple wine was drunk in large quantities. Although Lovin, 1935, stated that dancing was done to the accompaniment of drums and maracas, we have no really good descriptions of it. For example, we do not know whether the dancers were men or women, or if they were special dress or ornaments. Most early chroniclers failed to mention dancing at all, even when they described feast. Yet like Lovin, we can piece together a few things. Burton spoke of island Indians dancing all night. All right, dancing all night, making all a noise with gourds, wherein are many pebble stones to ward off evil spirits. Women are mentioned as wearing shell bands on their legs that shook as they moved, a custom reserved for male dancers among modern Garifuna. Dancing to the rhythms of drums is described for Arawaks, but not for the Caribs of the Lesser Antilles. We might conclude that drums could not have been as prominent a feature of Carib ceremonial life as they are today without having stimulated greater comment. Lovin claimed that in the 17th century the drum was known only in the form of the European skin drum, dodge the hijack, by which he apparently meant a log with skin over one end. Presumably, he got his description from Rochefort. Unfortunately, no sketches of the drum were made, so it is impossible to tell whether it was similar to those used today by Garifuna. South American Carib Arawak peoples apparently do not use the same drum form, so it is likely that the modern type was copied very early either from Europeans or from Africans. So if the history tells us there was actually, if anybody foreign was coming more European than African, then it's probably from Europeans, right? Farabi described the central Arawaks of British Guiana in 1918 as using both rattles and bone or bamboo flutes to accompany their dancing and singing, which involve a solo voice plus a chorus. The same can be said for Garifuna music today, though the comment is so general as to not be very meaningful. As for the South American Central Arawak, oil and red paint were more important than clothing as body adornment and protection for the island Caribs, though loincloths were reported and used by both sexes. In addition, women's cowls were bound for beauty's sake, as were the heads of both sexes. Several sources claim that the black Caribs started molding their children's head only after the French had brought in slaves in the early 18th century. Rumor has it. The better to distinguish the sons from these other blacks. However, since head molding was mentioned for the island Caribs from the beginning, it seems probable that the blacks merely continued what some of their ancestors had done. So again, flattening out the forehead, that was done since ancient times here in the Americas, right? You can't say that was because they were brought by African slaves, right? So there were certainly other characteristics that separated them from the slaves, and head molding seems an extreme measure if they had not already been convinced of its aesthetic value. Anderson said that the same Vincent black Caribs gave it up shortly before the Carib War because they had been ridiculed by other blacks. What other blacks? Head shaping was commented upon in Central America several generations later. Pim and semen, though it is not clear how common it was at that time, Garifuna today have no memory of it. The Methodist missionaries, Mr. and Mrs. Baxter, had the following to say about the black Caribs of St. Vincent in 1788. As a people, they are much handsomer than the Negroes. That's the hijack. What Negroes? You see how they're separating people. They appear more muscular and alert, and almost constantly assuming martial air. Even their women put on a warlike appearance and seem familiarized with the weapons of destruction. They have Amazonian blood in them, cutlasses and other accoutrements, and frequently in their hands, and knives are suspended by their naked sides. Even in times of peace, they exhibit an armed neutrality. And both sexes display a state of preparation either for offensive or defensive war. Of course, by 1788, the black Caribs had been pressured by the British for more than a generation, and it is not surprising that they should have been constantly on guard. Although some of them attended the Baxter School for a while to learn English, they were not swayed by the new religion that was being taught to them, and the Baxters soon gave up in disgust. Only a very few of the black Caribs who arrived in Central America seem to have been English speakers. So it is probable that these combined English and religion lessons reached only a few people and or were too short-lived to have been successful. The domestic organization of the island Caribs can be and has been interpreted in a number of different ways. Some of the early accounts state that the residence for a couple after marriage was uxorilocal. Uxorilocal. Although there is a hint of bride service, which suggests that this may have been a temporary measure during the first years. Uxorilocality would accord both with recent South American Carib ethnography and with Farabi's 1918 observations for the Arawaks. The fact that the term for wife was the same as that for mother's brother's daughter, mother's brother's daughter, whoa, further supports this interpretation since the preferential matrilateral cross-cousin marriage often coincides with uxorilocality. The practice perpetuates a residential core of related men, in spite of the fact that it is the bride who remains at home after marriage. As in some, but not all, mainland Carib groups, the island Carib men spend much of their time in a village man's house, leaving their wives and children to occupy their individual huts. As Taylor noted, such a socio-economic unit was divided by its very nature into an in-group consisting of the women together with their unmarried sons and out-group containing all the husbands. Helms has argued on the basis of the early accounts that island Carib domestic organization was basically consanguineal, with the men as husband fathers being somewhat peripheral, similar to the matrifocal or consanguineal households described for the Garifuna. My reading of the data, as well as my understanding of the structure of matrifocality and consanguineal households, has led me to reject Helm's idea entirely. There is simply no evidence for the island Carib women having anything like the status and authority we see today among the Garifuna. There are many contrary data that make Helm's argument difficult to accept. Not only was divorce said to be frequent and easy for the men, but not for the women, but polygamy was also permitted for chiefs. In the latter case, a chief established a separate village containing his several wives and their children, each apparently in a separate house. Presumably then, when his daughters married, their husbands would join their father-in-law for some unspecified period of time. And if the sons-in-law did not become chiefs themselves, perhaps they stayed in the wife's village permanently. If these unmarried husbands were also the sons of the chief's sisters, this would have been a means of perpetuating newly localized matrilineage, but only if the polygamy were also sororal polygyny, so that all the chief's daughters belonged to the same lineage. Wow. Taylor found linguistic forms he thought suggested that such a marriage form was prevalent. Also, divorce under the normal circumstances would put the man, not the woman, at a disadvantage, for he would be the one who had to leave the settlement. Finally, it would have given the chief authority over their sisters' sons rather than over their own. However, it is important to note that all of this is hypothetical since we have no direct evidence of the existence of unlineal descent system among either the island or the Black Caribs. In fact, island Carib leadership, at least in the late 18th century, was at least partially hereditary from father to son. It is possible that we are dealing here with a form of domestic organization that became highly altered as a result of the nearly constant warfare described above. Dreyfus provides a thoughtful and detailed analysis of the early island Carib domestic and political organization based upon available documentary records. She knows that raiding forays and trading networks were important means for the chiefs to build up their spheres of influence, and she likens the resulting definitions of status to that of big man in Melanesia. It may be that there was, in fact, an incipient hierarchical organization by the end of the 18th century in which success in actual warfare, as opposed to raiding for captives, as well as success in related diplomatic activity, were skills taught by fathers to their sons. By that time, there was no evidence whatever of bonds between a Carib man and his sister's son, but the Europeans may have failed to discern what they would have seen as an unnatural tie. When Chief Chayote was killed in 1795, his son, said to be the only 12 years old, was recognized as the new leader by both the British and Black Caribs. But see page 47 for another interpretation of the basis of Chateau's power. Furthermore, two brothers shared the leadership of one faction among those deported in 1797. It is also significant that only the chiefs were reported as owning slaves and engaging in significant trade. Their dependent males were apparently not merely their sons, nephews, and son-in-laws, but captured or even purchased blacks, some of whom eventually achieved son-in-law status. Purchased blacks, whatever they were, Indians, right, or Black Europeans, they eventually became son-in-laws status, part of the tribe. Yeah, they speculate a lot, but a lot of it we've gone over in different researches we've done, right? So we can understand what they're saying, a little bit. The importance of the diplomatic skills of the Caribs during the centuries of contact with Europeans cannot be overemphasized. The ability to speak a European language placed a man in a position to obtain information about trading and employment opportunities as well as about possible enemy maneuvers. At some point before leaving St. Vincent, oratory skills were learned, for at least two accounts of impassioned Carib speeches are on record. Obviously, the ability of the Black Caribs to get the French to assist them in their attempts to retain their homelands also requires some negotiation. There is circumstantial evidence that some segments of St. Vincent Black Carib population had established friendly relations with the British, notwithstanding the difficulties and apparent misunderstandings that had occurred over their lands. Indeed, we cannot simply assume that the French or the British always used the Black Caribs as they pleased for their own purposes. I have tried to demonstrate that by the 1770s, island Carib social structure had been replaced by a new pattern that was nonetheless unlike what we observe today among the Garifuna. Listen, this is kind of important, right? I believe new social and cultural forms were in the process of evolving. At the time, they were cut off, never to be revived with the deportation in 1797. Throughout the final months between the formal French surrender and the rounding up of the defeated Black Caribs, there are references to particular chiefs who either were killed or surrendered along with their people. Many were mentioned by name in ways that show they were well known to their enemies. The names of those mentioned in 1796 can be compared with the names of 28 Black Carib chiefs who signed the infamous 1772 treaty with the British. The only two names on both lists are Chateauyer and Duval. These two and someone named Manuel are also on the list of captains taken by the Spaniards from Roatan to Trujillo in May 1797, although Chatoyer had become Satule, referring to the son of the chief killed in the Carib War, and Duvalet or Duval had become Dubali. So these are like supposed Indian, black Carib Indian chiefs here with these names, right? The 1772 list shows both Lalime Jr. and Lalime Sr., presumably father and son. Duvalet's son, also called a chief, was named Regis. While it is not possible to trace genealogies from these lists, we can possibly assume that there were more than these four father-son pairs. It is clear that the black Carib population of St. Vincent had grown considerably by the end of the 18th century. Although many of the details mentioned by the earliest priests and travelers are still recognizable in the latter accounts, it is my judgment that Carib society had by 1763 entered a new phase with different basic characteristics from its predecessors. Island Carib had become black Carib, and contrary to what has previously been believed, all right, again, they were always so-called black. He's trying to say, at this point is when they're like literally being reclassified, like literally being called black, literally putting that black on them. And contrary to what has previously been believed, the Afro-European overlay was probably structurally significant. The European overlay, the European, because we know it's not African, the European, the ecological setting had also changed, of course, for both Island Carib and Black Carib territory had been severely diminished, and the former raiding and trading networks with other Carib-speaking peoples had been largely replaced by war and trade with Europeans. Clearly, by this time, the Black Caribs had an efficient food production and storage system, and the beginnings of what we might call a foreign policy. The adoption of new crops and the domestication of fowl, pigs, and cattle both improved their own diet and opened markets for them, leading to the development of a money economy. Larger canoes were valuable in transporting goods and people from St. Vincent to other islands, both in times of peace and in war. So let's look at this graph real quick. And it says, Table 1-2, names of Black Carib chiefs as recorded by British and Spanish authorities. All right, Black Carib chiefs, right? These are their names, guys. Look. Different years, right? Chatoyer, Satul. They became Satul. This is the names they became. So Saint Laurent became Cuffy Wilson, then Huayba. Broca became Jean Tolly, then Jean Pierre. Wow. Some forgotten Black Carib chiefs right here. Jean Baptiste, huh? There were perhaps incipient chiefdoms, although there is too little information to be sure. Leaders were not only fluent in French and perhaps in English, but they were sophisticated in dealing with Europeans in general. Anderson stated, one second. As Anderson stated, they were not an ignorant people. From their long communication with Europeans, they were far more intelligent than any other race of savages. A lady in St. Vincent wrote in June 1789, I saw several of them, among whom some are greatly civilized, and if you can read, there is something very noble in the spirit and manners of those that are improved, far surpassing the Negroes in general. Far surpassing the Negroes, the rest of the Negroes. So they are Negroed. By 1797, nearly all the Caribs had adopted French names. All the Caribs had adopted French names. Some had converted to Roman Catholicism, probably in parts as a diplomatic move. Their success in warfare cannot be attributed to French leadership, for their tactics were notoriously different, much to the distress of the English, who were not accustomed to adversaries who hid in the cane fields, shot from the branches of trees, and preferred to attack at night. Carib guerrilla attacks and raids succeeded in destroying an estimated 1/3 of the British properties of St. Vincent before the war was over. the conquest and subsequent exile of the Black Caribs from St. Vincent, right? Exile, relocation. Black American Indians, Black Caribs from St. Vincent destroyed a more developed society than scholars in modern Garifuna have previously thought. Even though their numbers were diminished by perhaps as much as 75%, the surviving deportees managed to retain their sense of social cultural identity, dramatically expanding both their population size and their territory over the ensuing 200 years. They incorporated other blacks and eventually emerged as a unique people. They what? They incorporated other so-called black folks. These Black Caribs coming from St. Vincent who ended up in Central America, guys, incorporated other black folks, whatever they are, Black Indians, other black Europeans, both mixed. They incorporated into their people and eventually emerged as a unique people, dominating the labor market on the coast of Central America for more than 100 years. How they managed to do this in spite of so many obstacles placed before them relates to the concepts of ethnicity and ethnogenesis, which are the subject of the rest of this book. All right. So that's the kind of the end of the first part of first chapter. I'm gonna get to chapter 2, guys, the deportation. We're gonna get to that in the next installment of this reading. Again, this is already an hour and 45 minutes. I don't want the videos to be too long so people can actually sit through them. But I hope you guys enjoyed some of the history, if you didn't know, of the main, kind of ethnology of ethnicity of the Garifuna, where they kind of coming from. And from there, we can break it down even further, right? All these different migrations, relocations, people mixing with these people, you can start to get an idea who the Garifuna are. Okay, who was in St. Vincent? Who were really in St. Vincent? We're going to do a video on that. Even though we have a lot of videos on it already, separately, right? Not specifically, but we'll try to do that, okay? So let me go back to... Then I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. All right. Gonna change the cover a little bit, maybe the title, just so we can remember what part this was, and we're gonna get to the next part on another video. All right. I hope you guys are still there. Hope you didn't fall asleep. Thank you for tuning in again on your Sunday, giving me your time, reading along with me. And you guys see, these people are also enslaved. These are your Black Indians. This picture on the left is one that I have already. As you guys can see, it says Caribs at home preparing cassava according to primitive methods. That's Caribs from St. Vincent. They're still in St. Vincent, remember. This is what they look like, guys. All right. And we got a drawing right here of Caribs from the islands, the colonial drawing. Yep. You're very welcome, guys. Thank you for being here. I'll give you your day back. Appreciate everybody in the chat, in the live chat that was here live, reading along with me to the end. Thank you. Much love, guys. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters, all my moderators. Thank you for that. Thank you, my longtime followers, my channel members. I got some cool channel member only videos, guys. Check out my trip to the Caribbean island so you can see some of these folks too. Haha. Yeah, in the Caribbean island, there's some of these folks there. I'm not island, but part of Costa Rica, the side, Caribbean side. All right. And my trip to Jamaica, my whole blog every day. And my trip to Jamaica, in case you missed it, a members only video. Check out my Patreon page if you like to support a lot of good books and videos there as well. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed the reading. We'll come back to this book in a future episode. All right, the deportation. We get the details of the deportation from St. Vincent over to Central America and other islands and other parts of the world, even Africa, as we read today, even to West Africa. Black Indians, Black Caribs. That's the hijack with the African stuff. All right, my people, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Wow, wow. Oh, wow.